at 2:47 a.m. The sensors aboard the MQ-9 Reaper on its standard southern Syria surveillance orbit detected something that its automated classification system could not resolve. The object was at 28,400 feet, moving at 410 knots on a bearing of 217 degrees, southwest toward the Al-Tanf Garrison perimeter, 90 kilometers distant. Its radar cross-section was consistent with a medium-sized commercial drone. Its altitude was consistent with a commercially available long-range platform operating at the upper boundary of its certified ceiling. Its speed was at the high end of commercially available fixed-wing drone performance. None of these characteristics individually would trigger an alert. Combined, at 2:47 a.m., on a bearing that resolved directly to Al-Tanf in approximately 13 minutes, they generated an automated classification flag. Unknown aerial object, possible threat, confidence 61%. The MQ-9 operator logged the flag at 2:48 a.m. and queried the target using the aircraft's own radar. The return confirmed the radar cross-section estimate, approximately 0.18 square meters, consistent with a 40 to 60 kilogram airframe, the category that included commercial agricultural drones, advanced military surveillance platforms, and the Shahed series one-way platforms that the IRGC had proliferated across its proxy networks in the preceding 2 years. The distinction between a Shahed and a commercial survey drone at 28,400 feet and 90 kilometers was not immediately apparent from radar cross-section and speed alone. What was apparent was the bearing. A commercial survey drone at 28,400 feet, 90 kilometers from Al-Tanf, at 2:47 a.m. on a direct bearing to Al-Tanf, was not conducting authorized survey operations. No commercial survey operation had been authorized in this airspace. The flight plan registry for Syrian airspace showed no filed plans for this sector, altitude, or time window. The MQ-9 operator queried the air traffic monitoring database and confirmed no authorized flight in this sector. He elevated the contact at 2:49 a.m. Unknown aerial contact, unregistered flight, bearing Al-Tanf, 90 kilometers, 13 minutes. The response from the CENTCOM watch floor was immediate. The watch officer transmitted 2 simultaneous actions at 2:50 a.m. Al-Tanf was notified and moved to elevated alert posture, and engagement authority assessment for the unknown contact was requested under the Rules of Engagement Framework for unregistered aerial contacts bearing on U.S. installations. What followed over the next 11 minutes was the most compressed authorization process the watch officer had executed in her current assignment. The Rules of Engagement Framework for aerial contacts classified as unknown aerial object. The specific category assigned to this contact at 2:48 a.m. required a sequential confirmation process: radar confirmation, trajectory confirmation, airspace authorization check, identification attempt, and threat assessment. She had radar confirmation at 2:48 a.m., trajectory confirmation at 2:49 a.m., airspace authorization check at 2:49 a.m. What she was missing was identification. The rules required an identification attempt before engagement authorization. The identification attempt was the problem. A conventional aircraft, military or civilian, would respond to IFF interrogation on standard squawk frequencies. A drone with no transponder would not respond to IFF interrogation. The contact had no transponder. IFF interrogation at 2:50 a.m. produced no response. The contact was either a drone with no transponder or a manned aircraft with a failed transponder. Against a contact with a 0.18 square meter radar cross-section, the second possibility was technically possible, but operationally implausible. A manned aircraft in that radar cross-section category would be a microlight aircraft, operating at 28,400 feet, 410 knots, with no transponder, on a direct bearing to a U.S. military installation at 3 a.m., was a scenario she assessed as a lower probability than the drone classification. She transmitted the identification attempt completion, no response, and the threat assessment at 2:52 a.m., unregistered drone class contact, no transponder, bearing confirmed Al-Tanf, range 72 kilometers, engagement authorization requested. The engagement authorization returned at 2:54 a.m., 4 minutes after the original contact elevation. The contact was now 64 kilometers from Al-Tanf and 11 minutes from the perimeter at its current speed. The MQ-9 was the only armed platform in the contact's immediate engagement envelope. Its 2 Hellfire missiles could engage the contact at the MQ-9's current position. The Hellfire against a 0.18 square meter target at the MQ-9's engagement range was a targeting geometry problem. The Hellfire's laser designation required a stable lock on the target's return, and a 0.18 square meter airframe at 64 kilometers provided a marginal designation quality. The MQ-9 began closing on the contact at 2:54 a.m., trading observation distance for engagement geometry. At 2:56 a.m., the MQ-9 operator acquired the contact visually on FLIR at approximately 45 kilometers distance. The FLIR return showed a fixed-wing airframe with a push-prop configuration, a design consistent with a loitering munition rather than a surveillance platform. A surveillance drone does not need a push-prop configuration optimized for sustained cruise at high altitude. A loitering munition designed for extended range does. The operator transmitted the visual confirmation at 2:57 a.m. Visual contact, push-prop configuration, assessed as loitering munition, 43 kilometers from Al-Tanf. Time to target at current contact speed, approximately 6 minutes. The MQ-9 closed to Hellfire engagement range at 2:59 a.m. The contact was 36 kilometers from Al-Tanf. Time to target, approximately 5 minutes. The MQ-9's laser designator locked on the contact's airframe at 2:59 a.m. The designation quality was marginal. The 0.18 square meter target at 14 kilometers range against a dark sky background was at the minimum reliable lock threshold. The operator held the designation and waited for the system to confirm stable track. Stable track confirmed at 3:01 a.m. The Hellfire released at 3:01 a.m. The Hellfire missed. The contact had initiated a pre-programmed evasive maneuver, a lateral displacement of approximately 200 meters in 3.8 seconds, that moved it outside the Hellfire's terminal guidance cone before the weapon could adjust. The maneuver was not pilot-directed. It was automated, triggered by a radar warning receiver that had detected the MQ-9's laser designator the moment the stable lock was confirmed. The timing was precise. The evasive maneuver began 0.4 seconds after the Hellfire's release, when the designator's lock signal had been continuous for 2.1 seconds, the threshold at which the contact's countermeasure logic had been programmed to respond. Someone had tested how long a MQ-9's designator held stable lock before release and had programmed the evasive threshold just inside that window. This was not a drone that had been bought from a catalog and deployed. This was a drone that had been engineered against the specific engagement sequence of the platform most likely to intercept it in this theater. A loitering munition with an active radar warning receiver and a pre-programmed evasive maneuver library calibrated against the MQ-9's engagement parameters was a different class of threat than the Shahed 136 the system's previous engagement experience had been built against. The Shahed 136 does not maneuver in terminal phase. This did, and it did so with knowledge of its interceptor's behavior that required explanation. The Hellfire impacted empty air 180 meters behind the contact's current position. The contact had accelerated to 480 knots after the evasion maneuver and was now 29 kilometers from Al-Tanf. Time to target, approximately 3.5 minutes. The MQ-9 had one Hellfire remaining. The re-engagement geometry required closing the range to maintain designation quality. At 480 knots contact speed and the MQ-9's own maximum transit speed, the closure rate would not produce a second stable designation before the contact reached Al-Tanf's perimeter. The watch officer transmitted the Hellfire miss and the contact's updated position and speed to CENTCOM at 3:02 a.m. She simultaneously queried, what other assets were in engagement range? The answer was limited. The nearest Patriot Pace-3 battery was positioned at the Syrian-Iraqi border crossing 140 kilometers northeast of Al-Tanf, outside the contact's trajectory and unable to establish the geometry required for an engagement from that position. The nearest F-15E aircraft were on alert at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, 190 kilometers west. Transit time to engagement range, approximately 12 minutes. The contact had approximately 3 minutes. At 3:02 a.m., Al-Tanf had a working air defense option from within the base perimeter itself. The C-RAM Phalanx unit installed on the base's eastern perimeter, positioned specifically for terminal defense against inbound aerial threats. The Phalanx operates at ranges out to 1.5 kilometers against aerial targets at low altitude. A contact at 28,400 feet approaching at 480 knots would reach Phalanx range in approximately 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The C-RAM engagement at Al-Tanf would be the terminal defense. The Phalanx engages on automated targeting. Radar acquisition, solution computation, and fire are all automated functions once the system is in autonomous mode. The operator's role is to confirm the system is operating within its authorized engagement envelope and to intervene if it acquires a non-threat target. Against a contact that had been established as an unregistered drone-class loitering munition with a confirmed trajectory to the base, the Phalanx autonomous engagement was the appropriate terminal defense response. The base commander authorized Phalanx autonomous mode at 3:03 a.m. The contact descended from 28,400 feet to 4,800 feet, in the final approach phase beginning at 3:03 a.m. The terminal dive profile that moved the platform from its cruise altitude to its attack altitude and simultaneously increased its speed to approximately 540 knots in the diving phase. This was the attack sequence. A surveillance drone does not dive. The Phalanx radar acquired the contact at 3:04 a.m. at 3.8 kilometers range. The contact's descent and acceleration had moved it into the Phalanx's lower acquisition threshold faster than the standard Shahed profile would have. The Phalanx Fire Control computed a firing solution at 3:04 a.m. The contact was at 2.1 kilometers and closing at 540 knots. The Phalanx fired at 3:05 a.m., 750 rounds in a 1.8-second burst. The 20mm Phalanx cannon generating a dense projectile cone at the computed intercept point. The tracer stream was visible from positions across the base perimeter. The contact impacted the tracer cone at approximately 1.4 kilometers from the Phalanx position. The 20mm projectiles struck the airframe in multiple locations. The contact's trajectory deviated from the computed impact point. Instead of impacting the base's communications infrastructure, which had been the assessed target based on the contact's approach angle, the contact's non-functional guidance system produced a terminal ballistic arc that carried it into open terrain 280 meters outside the base perimeter's eastern fence. The warhead functioned on impact. The detonation produced a crater in open terrain. No base infrastructure was within the primary effect radius. No personnel were in the open terrain at the point of impact. The base's perimeter security team confirmed the impact and the absence of any secondary effects at 3:07 a.m. The blast pressure had registered on the base's seismological sensor at 3:06 a.m. The sensor had been installed specifically to record such events. It recorded this one and archived it. Al-Tanf Air Base was undamaged. The communications infrastructure that the contact's approach angle suggested as the intended target was intact. 11 personnel who had moved to blast protection positions at 3 a.m. when the elevated alert went out remained in those positions until the all clear at 3:09 a.m. None required medical attention. In the CENTCOM Watch Center, the watch officer documented the engagement timeline at 3:14 a.m. The documentation noted 3 items of significant operational learning. First, the contact had a pre-programmed evasive maneuver capability triggered by radar warning receiver. This was not a capability previously confirmed in the IRGC's proxy drone inventory in this theater. The Shahed 136 fleet that had been the primary analytical reference point for this contact class did not have this capability. The evasion maneuver that had caused the Hellfire miss had been a new behavior. New behaviors required intelligence assessment updates. She flagged the contact's recorded maneuver parameters for the CENTCOM Intelligence Directorate at 3:15 a.m. Second, the terminal defense dependency. The MQ-9 had been the only long-range engagement asset available, and its Hellfire had missed. Al-Tanf's Phalanx had been the backup. The Phalanx had worked, but the margin had been 280 meters of open terrain between an impacted guidance system and the communications infrastructure the approach angle suggested as the target. 280 meters was not a comfortable margin against a 40-kilogram warhead. Third, the identification requirement delay. 4 minutes from contact elevation to engagement authorization was the fastest this identification-to-authorization sequence had been completed in a non-exercise context. It had still consumed 4 minutes of the 11-minute threat window. A contact moving faster than 480 knots or appearing at a closer range would not have provided a 4-minute identification window. The rules of engagement framework's identification requirement was policy. The policy had been built for specific operational contexts. Whether those contexts still match the evolving drone threat in this theater was a question for the post-operation review board, not the watch floor at 3:14 a.m. She transmitted all 3 items to the appropriate review channels at 3:16 a.m. and closed the immediate incident record. The F-15Es from Muwafaq Salti that had launched at 3:04 a.m. arrived in the Al-Tanf area at 3:16 a.m. 12 minutes after launch, 3 minutes after the Phalanx engagement, 7 minutes after the all clear. They established an air patrol over the area and held until 5 a.m. when the watch officer assessed the immediate threat period as resolved. They returned to Muwafaq Salti at 5:07 a.m. without engaging additional contacts. The contact's launch origin had been assessed with 77% confidence as a position in eastern Syria approximately 260 kilometers northeast of Al-Tanf, consistent with an IRGC-affiliated logistics position that had been under surveillance for 9 months. The 77% confidence was noted. It was not sufficient for an immediate counter-engagement. It was sufficient for a surveillance priority elevation that would produce additional collection over the following 72 hours. At 3:19 a.m., the MQ-9 that had been the first responder to the contact resumed its standard surveillance orbit. Its remaining Hellfire, the one it had not fired because the second engagement geometry had not been available before the contact reached Al-Tanf, was still on its weapons station. The first Hellfire had missed because the target had maneuvered. The miss had been an operationally novel event. The operator logged the maneuver parameters in the weapons employment database, including the lateral displacement rate, the timing relative to laser designator activation, and the angular geometry of the evasive maneuver relative to the Hellfire's terminal approach axis. The database entry would be reviewed by the Engagement Effectiveness Assessment Team within 48 hours. It would inform modifications to the engagement sequence protocol for this target class, specifically a dual designator approach using 2 aircraft to prevent a single-axis evasion from defeating both designators simultaneously. The database entry took the operator 6 minutes to complete. It was the most consequential 6 minutes of documentation in the night's engagement record. The maneuver that had caused the Hellfire miss would not cause the next Hellfire miss because the parameters were now in the database and the protocol modification was already being drafted. The Phalanx had worked. The modification would make the long-range intercept work next time. Time from initial MQ-9. Contact detection to base all clear. 22 minutes. Contact classification, unregistered loitering munition class platform, push prop configuration, radar warning receiver equipped, pre-programmed evasive maneuver capability. Airframe size, approximately 0.18 square meter radar cross-section, estimated 40 to 60 kilograms. Warhead, conventional, functioned on impact in open terrain. Engagement sequence, MQ-9, Hellfire, 3:01 a.m., miss, contact evasive maneuver. Phalanx C-RAM autonomous engagement, 3:05 a.m., confirmed intercept in the terminal phase. Contact impacted open terrain, 280 meters outside Al-Tanf eastern perimeter, 3:06 a.m. Al-Tanf airbase status, undamaged. No personnel in impact zone, no infrastructure within primary effect radius of terminal impact. U.S. personnel, 11 moved to blast protection positions at 3 a.m., all returned to stations at 3:09 a.m., no medical attention required. Equipment expenditure, 1 AGM-114, Hellfire missile, miss, 1 Phalanx 750 round burst. Intelligence assessment update. Confirmed new evasive maneuver capability in IRGC proxy drone inventory. Engagement sequence protocol modification recommended for this target class. Launch origin assessed with 77% confidence, surveillance priority elevated. The 22 minutes from detection to all clear had covered detection, identification, engagement authorization, a Hellfire miss, a Phalanx terminal engagement, and a terminal impact in open terrain 280 meters from the nearest infrastructure. The 280 meters was the outcome. The engagement sequence that had produced the 280 meters was the record. The maneuver database entry that would prevent the next Hellfire miss was the consequence. The Phalanx round count after the engagement: 750 rounds expended. Current inventory status: sufficient for 7 additional engagements of equivalent duration. Resupply was scheduled for the next rotation. The operator closed his engagement log at 3:22 a.m. The MQ-9's surveillance orbit resumed at 3:19 a.m. The orbit resumed on the same track it had been flying when the contact appeared at 2:47 a.m., 35 minutes earlier. The orbit had never deviated from its original track. The MQ-9 had simply closed on the contact, missed with its Hellfire, and returned to orbit. A 35-minute interval. 1 miss, 1 Phalanx intercept, 280 meters of open terrain. The parameters were in the database. The next engagement sequence would be different. At 4:15 a.m., the CENTCOM Intelligence Directorate reviewed the engagement record and flagged a finding that the watch officer had noted but not analyzed. The evasive maneuver's threshold timing, 2.1 seconds of continuous designator lock, matched almost exactly the known release-to-impact interval of the AGM-114K variant of the Hellfire, the specific variant loaded on MQ-9S operating in this theater. The 0.4-second post-release evasion start meant the contact's guidance system had determined that at 2.1 seconds of continuous lock, release was imminent and had initiated its evasion accordingly. An evasion that begins 0.4 seconds after release is too late to affect a Hellfire that has already departed the rail. But this evasion had succeeded, which meant the contact had a faster post-release trajectory maneuver than the Hellfire's terminal guidance could accommodate, or the initial displacement had been large enough to move it outside the laser cone before the weapon adjusted. The finding was added to the intelligence assessment under a new flag. Possible. IRGC proxy drone designed with specific knowledge of U.S. engagement parameters. The flag required additional collection to substantiate. It was generating collection tasking within the hour. The evasion had failed to protect the contact from the Phalanx. It had succeeded in generating an intelligence question that would take months to fully resolve. 280 meters of open terrain, 1 database entry, 1 unanswered question about where the threshold timing had come from. The engagement was closed. The questions it had generated were not.